2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
Our Professor of Politics, Jim Jose. Good morning, mate.
Morning, Mark.
Lots happening as we're obviously in an election year now. Some opinion polls have come out this week. Border security has been very much the focus of the government and others. Where are we landing with this?
Well, I'm not quite sure how to read these because the polls are looking very good. This particular poll looks very good for the government, except for the fact that it's the first major opinion poll after Christmas period.
And what does that normally set for the sitting government?
Well, basically, they're not as much in the news in a negative way. They haven't necessarily put a foot wrong. So the poll has been interpreted by some as reflecting voter responses, if you like, to the debate last week. But the poll happened in parallel with that debate, and some of the people polled may have been after the legislation went through the Parliament, so could have reflected on that. But I think that poll is one that we could say, look, it's been a while since politics was sort of taken seriously in the sense of, the Parliament's only just got back to sitting. So we would be looking for more evidence than this, in particular because in Queensland there was another poll taken solely of Queensland voters, and the Labor Party came out much stronger and the coalition parties came out a lot less strong, shall we, in that context. So that's particularly, I suppose, peculiar to Queensland. Now,
you would think so, wouldn't you? It would be generally a more conservative base up there, generally.
Well, Queensland is a sort of bit volatile in many ways because the government needs to hold some of the seats and Labor needs to win some extra seats. And there are a number of marginals there. But if the government sort of looks at that poll, in the national poll rather, and looks at that and says, oh, we're doing fine, we're doing okay, our strategy is cutting through, I think they would be wise to sort of step back and think, because their only strategy at the moment is one based around scaring voters into believing that Labor and the other parties are soft on border security.
So if we go back to needing more evidence, assuming that we stay on a similar trajectory that we are for a little while, are you thinking maybe one more poll, a couple more polls might give us a better clue on where the government lands on this?
Perhaps. I mean, it's we're in a strange situation as well, Mark, because it's only this week of parliamentary sitting, or at least of the lower house, and then the government isn't exposed to sort of parliamentary scrutiny until literally the election. And
I think that could be a bad thing too for them, because a lot of people are thinking, well, maybe the government's not really doing enough to sell their message if they're not out there selling it, or in the Parliament seeming to be fighting for something.
Well,
this could go against them.
Yeah, possibly.
Maybe.
But I think that not being seen in the Parliament is probably a good thing, because when you look back over the past 12 months, or even just the period in which Scott Morrison has been the leader, there are not very many success stories for the government to turn around and say, this is what we've achieved. In fact, the only thing I can think of immediately that they can point to and try and claim credit for is the fact that the revenue side of the budget has unexpectedly increased faster than predicted. So the government is able to tell a good news story, at least about how the particular political claims made about deficits and so forth. But beyond that, and even that is not to the government's actual credit in terms of managing something, it's actually dynamics beyond outside the government's control.
But they're going to try and I was going to say stitch it up that way, but they're going to sell that message, and I think people generally buy that message, don't they?
Well, they'll be able to tell a good news story around that. Other parts of the economy and perhaps not so easily translated into good news stories. And then there are all these other multiple scandals happening around, for example, the Paladin Holdings and Manus Island and the contract that they won on a 6-day restricted tender process. That's a really questionable thing to have happen. The tender processing from Home Affairs in 2017 is still another area. There's the scandal with Michaela Cash and the AWU and the raid by the Australian Federal Police and the political fallout around that, and whether this was done solely as a political stunt rather than a genuine an investigation of a genuine crime or a breach of the electoral process. We can sort of multiply the various things that the government has had some difficulties with, in which it's been sort of lucky in some respects that it hasn't received greater fallout. But at the moment, its strategy going into the polls, it's almost in caretaker mode now, and we're only in February, and if the election doesn't happen until May, we've sort of got this caretaker government that's not really governing. It's just simply sitting there in a holding pattern, hoping that things don't go bad for it over the next few months, and that they can continue to convince voters that the Labor Party as an alternative government is not viable. That's to say that if you vote for the Labor Party, you'll have a party in government.
Economy will go bad, border protection will go weak, all that sort of stuff.
All
Core messages.
The only strength they have at the moment, is to say the government has, politically speaking, is more or less a fear campaign. Whether that will be sufficient to keep voters on its side or to increase voters to come over to their side, that I think is still an open question. And, the Labor Party itself, it also has a few problems that it has to try and overcome. A couple of policy areas like the superannuation changes that it wishes to make in regards to franking of investment shares and so forth. That may have, that's another area the government's going to try and get some mileage on as well.
That's a tough one for them, that one.
And the Labor Party's trying to fix one problem, but it's creating other problems. And those other problems may well be the middle range voters that they're going to rely on or need to either stick with them or to come across from the Liberal fold. That's the hip pocket nerve is one which often shifts voters in a hurry. And the Labor Party's got a bit of an uphill battle to make sure that its message around this is for the good of the country, for the good of whatever the message is that they need to bring out with that. But the government here has at least one opportunity to be able to show and differentiate itself, perhaps in a more positive way. And one would hope that the Scott Morrison government is able to actually focus on a few positive things, but it's very, very thin on the ground at the moment for them.
I think all the parties at the moment are trying to find that low-hanging fruit. If it's there, I'm sure they'll find it before the election. Jim, thank you very much as always.
Yep, my pleasure, Mark.
Our Professor of Politics, Jim Jose, right here on 2NURFM 103.7.